Gentlemen, my name is Karl. I am the Education and Community Outreach Officer here at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Trevor Carmichael Wall Garden Theatre at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society this evening, where we are going to enjoy the first lecture in this year's lecture series, Watson's World, where we're going to be looking at the wonderful and incredible legacy that Dr. Karl Stewart Watson has left to us. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our chair for the evening, Andrea Richards Cummings, and she will do the honors and keep everything on track for the rest of this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Allow me to say welcome again, even though Kay did us that honor already. I'd just like to say, thank you for taking the time to come out this evening to this first in the lecture series that honors the life and work of Dr. Karl Watson. I am the archaeology lecturer at the University of the West Indies, and I am there today because of the legacy of Dr. Watson. We're able to restart the archaeology program and to celebrate having 14 students who are today interested in the field of archaeology, and importantly, they know of the work of Dr. Watson to Barbadian archaeology. Our speaker this evening is Kevin Farmer, who you all know well, but someone who was a former student of Dr. Watson, and had the opportunity to also contribute to the archaeology program at St. Augustine and also the Heritage Studies program at Cave Hill campus. He knows the archaeology of Barbados well, and we just want to say, welcome Kevin Farmer. You know him as the Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum, but he's so much more to the field of archaeology in Barbados. And so I just want to say again, we welcome your presence. We look forward to lots of engaging questions and discussion this evening. There's a lot happening in the field right now in archaeology. We need to really think about the path that we're taking as we look towards the future, how we want archaeology to progress in this country. So we're really looking for insightful discussion this evening and looking forward to your presentation, Mr. Farmer. With that, I'll say welcome to the stage and have a good presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. What is it? All protocols haven't been established. I've got a little bit of technology with me. I might not need it, but this afternoon is really a celebration of Karl Stewart Watson and his legacy not only to archaeology, but to the field of heritage and heritage preservation in Barbados. Okay. There you go. The many faces of Karl. Some that we would have seen, him being fully kitted out with a beard is not something that you see very often. It is a legacy of COVID that he then promptly got rid of after COVID. Karl Stewart Watson legacy will take us some years to fully comprehend and understand, because unfortunately, Karl began to write when computers were things held in rooms that were over 40 to 500 feet in diameter. So searching for a lot of what Karl wrote in his early years is almost impossible to find. Odd references on the internet. But educated at Harrison College, UWI, K-Phil, and then the University of Florida, where he wrote Barbados, the Civilized Island, gives us a really good insight into what his overall ethos would be. It's in doing this research that I tried to find Barbados' civilized island again. And there's a particular quote I found quite insightful that more or less speaks to him his introduction to his PhD about trying to understand what this island would have been in its early colonial development, says, finally, this study hopes to persuade Barbadians of the futility of either looking to Europe or Africa exclusively for inspiration. Both continents contributed to the gestation process, but in the final analysis, the offspring was unique, with characteristics of its own, and it is on this unique Barbadian nature that one should first draw when seeking inspiration for any creative process. And this was written in 1975, published in 1979. And it is that uniqueness of the Barbadian character, that uniqueness of Barbadian identity, that winds thread and tapestry through all of Karl's work for the next 50 plus years. He goes to Mona in 1981, joining a interest in the Department of History. So if you can just take it back one. Thank you. Now let's see if the pointer works. A young Kamal Braffett. Go back one else, let's speak to the others. In that group, one of two very interesting people who basically begin to formulate the early development and understanding of archaeology and heritage in this region. Hopefully one can identify Karl in a khaki shirt and jeans, looking off into the distance with his trademark smirk. Behind him is Barry Higman. Missing from this particular photograph is a gentleman that I'm going to go to in the next slide. Professor E. Kofi Agorsa. Professor Agorsa is one of those early students looking at African American archaeology in the Caribbean. He's a student of a gentleman called Merrick Posnaski, who's also the teacher of both Dr. Agorsa and those of you with an interest in Caribbean archaeology, Doug Armstrong and Chris DeCourse. And it is that thread of anthropology and that trying to understand African archaeology outside of the United States that also winds its way back to Karl in the 80s in Jamaica. In Jamaica with Kofi Agorsa, they excavate plantation sites like Papine and Golden Grove. And then Kofi decides he wants to go up into the hills. And of course, when we talk about hills in Jamaica, we are talking about mountains. It is at Mount Hillaby. Into the Blue and John Crow Mountains, into Akapong, to understand the maroon heritage of that island. And when we speak about maroon studies today, it is Kofi Agorsa. When we speak about that early development of archaeology at Mona campus, it is Kofi Agorsa, Karl Watson, and Barry Higman, ultimately leading to the MA in Heritage Studies at Mona, started by Barry. And even though Karl would have been in Barbados at that time, would journey back to Jamaica to teach at that class. I would also note that the class at the time was quite forward-thinking because it included museum studies in it. And a certain young Alessandra Cummings taught in that program in the early 90s. But what Karl contributed there was not simply about historic archaeology. In fact, his first writing in the Jamaica Journal in 1988 was to examine and speak of the petroglyphs at, let me see if it now works for me, at Mountain Riven Cave in Jamaica. His paper is still cited today by those who have an interest in prehistoric rock art, whether it is pictographs, or petroglyphs. Because one is actually drawn on the surface, the other is incised into the rock itself. And it is about just not the uniqueness of Barbadiana, but the uniqueness of us as a people, whether indigenous, creolized, or plural, is what captivated Dr. Watson. By the time he leaves Mona after the passage of Gilbert, comes to the Cave Hill campus, he's gone through many phases. At Mona, he starts off as a Latin Americanist because Karl spoke about 6 languages fluently and 3 or 4 different dialects. Utterly amazing, since I can barely speak the one that I was born with. And he uses that to allow his students and others to have a wider understanding of what this Caribbean is. He's written papers in French and Spanish literature. He's looked at archaeology in those spaces as well, in their own language. Traveled up the Amazon, and photos there used in the Foundation of Civilization course at Mona, which incidentally, you can still find portions of what he wrote almost 40 years ago online and still being used as part of that foundational course at the Mona campus. But because of what has occurred in the last couple of weeks, I can't speak to Karl without mentioning Trevor Marshall and Professor Pedro Welch. For the simple fact that 2 out of the 3 taught me, but all 3 of them were grounded in understanding Barbadiana, and more especially in asking us to pay particular attention to our capital city of Bridgetown. And it is the archaeology of Bridgetown, that urban archaeology, that Karl excels. It is in understanding how such research allows us not only uncover our past, but have a greater appreciation for our present. And I dare say, such debates and discussions are very much informed today by what he did almost 40 years ago. So for that, I just want to pay special attention to them. And for me, covering the areas of archival research, critical thinking, gender, marginalized groups, contestation, Africa, Bajan, landscapes, ecology, society, and future. Again, coming out of the simple phrase of understanding the gestation that produced the uniqueness that is Barbados. Barry Hickman notes in a tribute written after Karl's passing, I like to think some of this experience from Mona fed into his time at Cave Hill and his growing preoccupation with heritage and the public understanding of the importance of the past in his beloved Barbados. There would be no heritage studies at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, if not for Karl Watson. There's some slides later on where I'll show a group of young students, many of whom ended up in cultural or heritage fields because of Dr. Watson, going back almost 30 years ago, to speak to part of that legacy. And even though the university is situated in Barbados, Karl's teaching of intro to history, historical techniques, investigation, and there's another course, techniques of history, made you recognize that the island is in fact part of an archipelago, and you needed to fully understand our archipelago to begin to understand not only Barbados, but its position in it. Organized field trips for year 3 students to St. Vincent, Dominica, and St. Lucia were very much looked forward to once you understood that that was what was happening once you got to third year, that there was an opportunity to go on a field trip to explore the history of another island and to understand it, both from its prehistory, its historic archaeology, and its ecology, and to understand how that tied into particular systems of empire, whether European on the one hand, or whether a larger sphere of influence amongst Amerindian peoples in the century or decades before European invasion. And of course, his exploration of caves and gullies was very much known by his students, who would occasionally be asked, well, I'm going to see a cave, who's coming? Or of course, to dive a privy, as happened on numerous occasions. Of course, everyone knows what a privy is, right? Yes, there you go. Fascinating things are dropped in privies. Really great ceramics always end up in a privy. And occasionally, interesting metal objects. And of course, the reason for that is a function of chemistry. You drop things in, it creates pockets, it allows for oxygen, bacteria gets to work. So you don't have to necessarily, rely on a turtle, which is so hard to find. So privies become interesting places to explore and to understand the material culture and its deposition. And of course, its importance and understanding of how it was utilized in a space like Barbados. Prehistory. Karl was involved in some of the digs at Port St. Charles Marina in Speightstown, led by Peter Druitt and his team from University College London, but also then involved in excavations at Spring Garden, at what Barbadians will call Exmouth, which used to be where Automotive Art had a building, and then where Mount Gay is still there. But that entire building area revealed a number of these pot stacks. So again, when we talk about uniqueness and innovation, we must recognize that he's also helping to recover part of the innovation of ceramic technology and actual ability to secure potable water. The Amerindian peoples would have dug to a freshwater lens, which is quite easy to find in a place like Spring Garden, hence why it is called Spring Garden, because there's so many springs. Bajan place names are extremely literal, for the most part. It is what it is. To secure that potable water, limestones will be placed in the bottom, and then the bottoms of ceramic vessels like this will be knocked out and stacked one on top of the other in order to secure that water supply. Again, literal pot stack. And in so doing, ensure that one had access to water. When we look at Exmouth today, all we see is a very small canal next to the court's pasture. I want you to imagine that that was actually a river mouth with flowing water that people actually used to go and wash their clothes on. There are historic postcards of that area in Watson's photographs of early Barbados taken from the Anne Yates collection. Yet another way in which his wide historical understanding and multidisciplinary approach allows one to feed into the other, where pictorial evidence reminds us of how a place might have been used, that then helps us to understand how it might have been used during some point in time in prehistory, or at the same time, how it might have been used within the historic period. The other such large river mouth is actually right next to Browns Beach, which has been canaled over the years. That would have been the stream leading from the Bay Plantation. In fact, that is why Carlisle Bay became such an important space for shipping, because the availability of fresh water on the first island that you're going to hit coming across the Atlantic, or conversely, the last island that you're going to pass, leaving the Caribbean to go across the Atlantic made it a very attractive space for safe harbor. It's one of the reasons why Bridgetown is where it is. And it's because of the availability of that spring water. And note that by saying this, recognize that if the Europeans are finding water, remember the people who lived there 2,000 years before, which are the Amerindian peoples, which we all tend to forget because, as far as we know, none of them walk amongst us until we do some DNA, and who knows what will pop up in our genome. But in understanding our prehistory, he brings us forward because he reminds us of the environment and ecology in which they would have lived and how part of that legacy still resides with us today. Whether it's a small tract of land at Turner's Hall Woods, or the fact that we still use the word mobby to describe a particular drink, which was an Amerindian name for a fermented drink made from cassava, as opposed to a boiled bark of a tree, which, mind you, in some of the islands in the region is allowed to ferment so it can have a little bit of alcoholic qualities. Field trips. This is in fact, my class in 1994, visit to St. Vincent. And botanic gardens, and actually being able to speak to and interview Earl Kirby, who at the time was perhaps the major antiquarian archaeologist on the island, to understand the development of the archaeology of St. Vincent at that time. Some of those sites are now gone, like Bookerman, which is now a hotel, and Argyle, which is now an airport. So the importance of why we do these field trips and what they tell us about the space in which we lived. And of course, going windward to go up into the Carib territory. Underscores how he recognized the need to instill in young West Indian students a better understanding of the space in which they lived in. In this class, you had persons from Barbados, Trinidad, Dominica, and St. Vincent. This is a Caribbean class in a Caribbean university. You can't just be learning the archaeology of where geographically the campus is situated. In this archipelago alone, you've got 12 or 13 islands that you need to explore and understand. And then there are those scholars who would have learned from Dr. Watson or asked particular questions to go and do work in places like St. Vincent. Now Finneran being one. Or where in Barbados can one begin to look at other aspects of archaeology? And I want to touch on the marginalization, because the marginalization is both economic and ethnic and religious. And Karl reminded us each day the importance of understanding that history. So whether it is having a young archaeology student like Michael Stoner excavate the then car park of the Jewish synagogue to find the mikvah, which is a ceremonial bath used by Jewish women before they enter temple, becomes important. The excavations done at Subtle Street to begin to understand what urban housing would have looked like in Barbados in the 17th and 18th century. Because again, we walk through the city not recognizing that Subtle Street, or what was then the Back Church Street, Mason Hall, are in fact some of the older streets in the city, going back to James Street. And it's bringing that understanding to bear to figure out how is this particular street then being configured. And of course, taking both the history and archaeology to inform maybe 10 or 15 years later, the nomination dossier for historic Bridgetown and its garrison. So all of this work outside of creating really nice papers, then has a quite practical and applicable process. It led to a World Heritage nomination. I want to thank the family of Dr. Watson, Patrick and his sister, in allowing the museum to record some of what was in his home. And in preparing for this, the director and those who had gone through the collection sent me a series of pictures, and I smiled at this. Right, obviously we know Karl. A young Helen Seaman who in that group becomes the first person from Dominica to have her PhD in examining the Carib history of Dominica. Unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. And others who went into the diplomatic service, others who stayed in history, but the majority of this group stayed in education, history, and archaeology. And that is a direct consequence of the teaching of Dr. Watson. So for those of you who know Cleve Scott, Cleve is in one of these pictures somewhere, and others. And this is just 1 year. The highlight for that year is going to Karl's house, cooking a big pot of shrimp curry, and just eating it, and talking about how the semester went, and deciding what are we going to do once we graduate. So teacher and mentor, and I dare say inspiration as well. But let's come to, for me, what is perhaps one of his biggest loves, and that is our capital city. Perhaps informed by the fact that Karl grew up in Culloden Road, ran about in the Bayland, had family who lived in Beccles Hill, and deemed that this portion of the island was almost his backyard, and that his understanding of history and archaeology meant that he had a particular responsibility in ensuring that its history was known and preserved. Perhaps the reason why for a very long time Karl was also president of the Barbados National Trust, after having served as one of the longest serving editors of the Barbados Museum Journal up to that time. And it is in understanding the 10,000 plus acres that makes up this small city that became a preoccupation. So we all know of his work at George Washington House. I mentioned Subtle Street, the uncovering of a 17th century cobble street in what we now refer to as Jubilee Gardens, and being able, whilst that development was ongoing, to have a conversation with the developer about safeguarding that particular archaeological feature. And in fact, the developer allowing for some archaeology to take place during development. And all of this happening on an island where there's still no single piece of legislation to safeguard our archaeological heritage. The developer, by the way, at that time was Barbados Tourism Investment, Inc. One Friday afternoon, whilst at the museum, receiving a call from Dr. Watson that a passerby had noticed some bones somewhere down in Fontebelle. What is now the small business center of the BIDC, next to the Barbados Advocate, the former residence of Annie Wilson, was being developed to build a new building. Area 100 meters by 100 meters was being excavated, and there were bones coming out of the ground, and the contractor was not stopping work. A passerby alerted the advocate, who then called Dr. Watson, who then called the museum. And then there's a nice spread in the Sunday Advocate and Sunday Sun of that week. Construction halts, and some excavation is being done. 3-meter by 9-meter square is left undisturbed, out of which 15 persons are recovered. It just so happens that Karl that year had bought at auction a small pamphlet of an English traveler to Barbados in the 1780s. It was called The Beneficent Bee. And in The Beneficent Bee, which he published in the museum journal, was a small excerpt of this young man following a group, his words, of Negroes out of the city who were singing and clapping but had on their shoulders a coffin. And they were taking it out of the city onto an area of loose sand near the beach, where they buried it, poured libations. Those bottles were thrown into the coffin, and much celebration. That historical document and the subsequent archaeology were one of the same. The document was the first written one that we'd seen of the description of a burial by black people. I can't say whether they were enslaved or free, we do not know. The material culture recovered was only the second time that a burial of black people in what you can constitute as a cemetery was actually found outside of Newton. None of that would have occurred if the passerby had not an interest and kept some noise, and someone called Karl. Because by that time, it was widely known, if you wanted to highlight the need to preserve Barbadiana, there are one or two people to call. Karl was the first one, who kept a certain amount of noise in a particular way that only Karl could do, that then garnered attention. That site was extremely important. Further documentary research revealed that it had in fact been purchased by a freed black man called Joseph Rachel, who recognized that there was no longer a burial ground in the city for enslaved or free black people, since the old St. Michael's Church was now being resuscitated to become St. Mary's. And as such, persons who were not Christian could not be buried there. He purchased that, let's call it, quarter acre of land in which freed black and enslaved people of the city could be buried. He dies, the will is passed on to his wife, still being utilized as a burial ground. We don't know when it went out of use, but clearly it did. It might have occurred maybe a century later, as we get towards the cholera epidemics and the realization that Barbados needed to have public burial spaces. And it falls out of use and memory until, of course, archaeology. But I say, if not for Karl. And again, some of us excavated that burial space and have written about it. And in 2005, Karl Watson, Frederick Smith, and myself wrote 2 papers. It's kind of interesting. One on Fontebelle and the other on the Pierhead, where they found yet another set of burials, which have yet to be fully excavated. We can only hope that in time that will occur before any more development happens on the Pierhead. And that is the old area behind Manning, Wilkinson, and Chandler. And for those of you who are of not that vintage, the old BTI car park. But we go back to the tremendous archaeology to be found in these 10,000 acres that we don't know is there until development occurs. We can't always wait for development to occur, or if development does occur, it should be made to, stop so that proper archaeology can be done, and then you can do whatever you want afterwards. But it only happens with legislation. Garson, obvious reasons. Karl and Peter Stevens in relocating and rediscovering the tunnels, the refurbishment work done at George Washington House, which was also called Bush Hill House at one point, and leading groups of students to, there's a gully to the, looking at this picture, to the right of the house. And there's a picture I have of Karl scaling down the gully wall with a rope. But again, privies and gullies are wonderful places to explore, because what do people do? Dump stuff. And what do you learn centuries later? Some of the interesting things they threw away, so you can better understand how they live. And yes, archaeology is sifting through other people's garbage. But at least it's a career. Gets you out of the office. But it's all about understanding that unique nature of. So we all know about the refurbishment of GW House, and the fact that it was taken back to its 18th century look. Those of you who remember, this was I think Light and Power had a credit union in this space, and there were lots of additions both to the front and side, which were taken away, designed by, I think, by Bruce Jardine, and now we have GW House just a couple hundred yards away from us. This is the academic as activists. This is the academic as almost entrepreneur in a way, because there are now people who work for the Bush Hill Trust, who, if not for the advocacy of the National Trust and Karl at the time, would not have a job. This is the practical application of academia at work. This is why public history and public historians and public archaeologists are so much needed. Can you go back two, please? One more. We talk about adaptive reuse, and we talk about influence and legacy. I might get my story wrong, so someone can correct me. Karl's ability to influence others to do good. We all know about Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary, where he convinced Peter R. Laird to buy the Nature Sanctuary. But Karl also convinced others to restore some of the larger historic structures in the city. Bottom left is the Martineau House. I can't remember if it's still owned by the Treelofts. But again, influenced by Karl to repair and restore. Many years of agitation for the refurbishment of the old and original town hall. So this is the town hall. What we knew as the Supreme Court building was the original town hall and jail, built in the 18th century. Note that it finally got restored, was it 2 or 3 years ago? Again, the architect there is Bruce Jardine. And of course, Pavilion Court, which clearly didn't take much for people to restore, because people always need houses and apartments. And that got very well used very early on. But it is really the progenitor of all the others. It shows you the inspiration for adaptive reuse. It shows how, if you care about the uniqueness of your culture and your heritage, you would do what you can to ensure its safeguarding and its reuse for another generation. And this very much underscored how Karl looked at and history and heritage. Others in this lecture series are going to touch on his ecological and his love of the animal kingdom, regardless of what it was. Be it the centipede that might sting you, or the monkeys that might raid your farms, or the stray cats that Karl would always take home and nurse. It was about having that greater appreciation for the world around you. And if you say you care for it, then care for it. Don't care for the one bit of it that you might like and not the other bit that you don't like. Commit. And that was Karl. I kind of mentioned the two postcard books which he edited, and I think Anne Watson Yates was his cousin. And what that has allowed us to do is to have that pictorial evidence that goes along with the material culture that we find that further backs up or contradicts the documentary heritage that is there. We like to say that, documentary evidence can occasionally lie. Archaeology never does. Because it always reveals what the documents don't necessarily record. Unfortunately, what it doesn't always tell us is who's doing the deposition of the material culture. But it allows us to understand how it's being used, when it's being used, and in some cases, the adaptive reuse of it as well. At Jubilee Gardens, he and Frederick found small ceramic objects that initially they thought might have been blanks for buttons, but eventually worked out, no, these were actually plain pieces. People used ceramics and made them more rounded so that they can play a game of whatever they were playing or gambling with, or used for some game like Worry, who knows? But it's just interesting what we can find once we take the time to excavate and record what is there. I spoke a bit about his work with World Heritage. Again, because we're talking about wider Barbados, beyond World Heritage, I want to put it in a wider framework of recognizing that there are parts of our landscape that are of national, regional, and international significance. Because of Watson's work, Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary became a Ramsar site. Because of his work with others, historic Bridgetown and its garrison is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I know that we also chatted with him about the next nomination and also the work that he did through the Barbados National Trust and the Jewish community in renovating and safeguarding what perhaps is one of the better examples of heritage restoration on this island, which is the city block of the Jewish synagogue. Took over a quarter of a century. Also reminds us that since it was built over 100 years ago, you can't fix it in a year, but it takes time. But there must be commitment. And that commitment must be underscored by sound and informed research, documentary, material culture, and oral history. And it's on the oral history I want to reflect, not for Barbados, but for Jamaica. There's a social history project at Mona, like there is at Cave Hill. And when Karl was there teaching intro to historical techniques, I actually taught a group of students how to do oral history. Those students then went out into the wider Jamaican community and captured the oral history evidence of those Jamaicans who were present during the 1938 labor riots in Jamaica. And that was published, I think, in 2009 with Professor Patrick Bryan. So again, the uniqueness and how it then weaves its way through different disciplines is really that legacy. And Karl scaling down the the back wall into the gully of the George Washington House, excavating the Port St. Charles Marina, and then an example of some of the prehistoric artifacts that he would have recovered during his various excavations on island. And of course, influencing, as I said, others like Frederick Smith's excavation in 2nd Street, Holtown, which is now quite topical. So when we speak about sites, monuments, and legacy, these are some of the more well-known ones. Fontebelle, Pierhead, Spring Garden, Subtle Street, Jubilee Gardens, Bush Hill House, Codrington College with Tom Lawfield, encouraging university archaeologists from UNC to bring a field school to Barbados to explore Codrington College, thereby allowing West Indian students the opportunity to actually have practical experience in archaeology. Again, is one of the legacies of Karl. And of course, the Jewish synagogue. And for those who attended his funeral, Dr. Honeychurch noted that he'd completed his book on the Jewish synagogue, which will be published posthumously. So we look forward to that publication. And of course, his reminding us of the need to commemorate and understand all of the players that took part in the Easter Rebellion of 1816. And if you were to go to the Builders' Wall in Freedom Square, to the rear of the wall on the right-hand side are all of the leaders of the 1816 rebellion etched into clay. So again, I'll ask the person who created it where she got the names from. That might come up in Q&A. And advocacy for heritage protection. The reason why we advocate now is because of Karl. I don't remember many people advocating when I was way younger. There's Morris Hutt on the ecological side, but there was no one really talking about archaeology or built heritage in that way. And Fred Smith reminded me and sent me this photograph of some work that we'd done in Holtown many years ago. Yeah, I won't point me out without a beard. I also know when you talk about legacy, the gentleman in between Fred and Karl is Mr. Richard Haynes, who happens to be the father of Senator Crystal Haynes. Need I say more? How we influence others in various and diverse ways. Jubilee Gardens, Bridgetown, like we don't always see it. Although if we take this shot again next year, it will be changed dramatically. For that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for allowing me to have that very small discussion on the legacy of Karl and its influence on archaeology and heritage protection in Barbados. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Kevin? If you have questions, please just go to the microphones in the aisles. Just a show of hands. If there are any questions, we can take the microphone to you.
What else was found in the burial excavation on Spring Garden? You said there were bottles thrown in and there were bones.
Oh, well, Fontebelle.
Yes.
So we found evidence of coffins. So there were coffin nails, There were tiny scraps of textile. There were bottles. There were agate beads and a very small mother of pearl something. But a very small bit, something carved with fish scales on it, but made from mother of pearl. So again, indicative that people had possessions and were buried with them. And the fact that you have the documentary account that speaks to the burial, it gives you a much clearer picture of what was taking place in 1787, which is when the account was written. As I said, it becomes one of the more interesting excavations, especially in the urban setting, where we can document and have material culture of an urban black burial site. Like I can't use the word enslaved simply because we know that both enslaved and free black people were used. So if you want to say Afro-Barbadian burial site or Afro-Barbadian cemetery, we can use that wording to describe it. They're at the museum. Yeah, no, not on display. They're hopefully when we renovate our central galleries, they will be on display. And in fact, that excavation was my MA thesis. So I know the things quite intimately. So yeah.
Hi, good evening, Kevin.
Hi, evening.
Could you tell me if I'm correct that archaeological work was done within caves at Trent's plantation, lands of Trent's?
They were, but we're not touching that here because we want to deal with what Karl had done. But yes,
Right.
there were excavation done at Trent's by Doug Armstrong. There are a couple journal articles in the museum's journal about Trent's. And in fact, two of the more important things there are the recovery of an enslaved village and the fact that the cave might have been used for both religious purposes as well as potentially rebellion, in that we found a cache of sharpened iron that could be used as knives or other tools in which to puncture people. So, yeah.
Having confirmed that to me, it follows my next question. In honoring the legacy of archaeological work done by Karl Watson at Fontebelle and all the places you have listed, what is your opinion with regards to having such honor done for, and the museum making an outreach now, and yourself and historians interested in enslavers and in those persons enslaved, in positioning, what is your position and what do you think should be done to honor the legacy of archaeological research left by Karl with regards to Trent's, now that we understand that the land there will be developed for the buildings the government requires to put there, since they are going to be releasing lands in Whole Town and need to construct at Trent's plantation, where previous archaeological work was done within caves, and you've just confirmed. So my question is, where do we go with Karl's legacy in archaeological research with regards to Trent's plantation today?
I'm gonna answer that in this way. To truly honor the work of Karl and others like him, the fact that Barbados is a signatory to the 1970 and 72 conventions as it relates to I was going to say material culture and patrimony, we must with alacrity have legislation. If we want to honor that legacy, we must with alacrity have legislation to safeguard our archaeological sites, spaces, and monuments. Because I'll then also be honest, I don't know if what is being proposed for the new civic center at Trent's actually occupies any of the land of the plantation excavated by Doug Armstrong. That I don't know. Again, but yes, but recognize the important thing there. None of that can happen without legislation. No. Legislation. You want to know why I say interest? The interest is there. The sites that we just talked about, all of the sites that we just spoke about, that Karl excavated, Karl and the museum excavated, Karl and Fred Smith excavated, all of them were done through moral suasion. You went to the landowner, you had a conversation with the landowner, and the landowner allowed you on their private property to conduct archaeology because there is no legislation. The largest example of this is the Port St. Charles Marina. The Port St. Charles Marina, over a period of 5 years, was excavated by a group from the University College London, Barbados Museum, through moral suasion. Speaking to the developer at the time, who understood the importance of the site and set aside time, provided both equipment and monies for persons to excavate the site, in some instances putting up archaeologists who arrived on island to do the work. But all of that was done in the absence of legislation. It is not, what we should be following is what happens to the environment in Barbados, where there is legislation. So any development on this island must have an EIA done by law. There's no development on this island that must have an archaeological investigation done by law. So the interest is there. If I don't get myself in trouble, we have one of the greatest democratic devices in our hands at this point in time. It's called a cell phone. Barbadians have been really good at using social media to advocate for. And I use the example of Nelson finally coming down as a petition by a young Barbadian that it's time that this particular statue went, and it went. So until Barbadians care enough and keep enough noise about it, we won't have that legislation, but the time is now. Because all of the interest in the world will not stop a developer from doing what they need to do on their private property. Yes.
Good night to everyone, and good night to you,
good night, sincere.
lecturer. In my research, I read about community archaeology being done in England and several places across the world. It seems to me like the work that Mr. Karl Watson was doing was, in some sense, community archaeology. Would you say that?
Yes, it was community archaeology and it was public archaeology. Again, where he excavated on private property, getting the permission of the private owner to allow Barbadians to come directed to conduct archaeology. So yes, that was community and public archaeology at work.
Okay, so what do you think should be the first step in agitating for legislation? Because it sounds incredibly strange that things have been done in Barbados without the legislation. What do we have to do?
I would simply, not getting myself in too much trouble, use your social media platforms to agitate for the protection of our archaeological heritage, much the same way that we agitate for other things. Because until the public takes an interest and values its past, how do you expect then to put pressure for legislation to pass to value or pass.
Okay, one brief last question. At the moment, I'm doing a kind of study on the George Washington House. I was quite fortunate to hear you speaking about that. I see that you said that there was a gully on the left of the George Washington House.
Yes.
Is the tunnels connected to that?
No, the tunnels are not connected to that. The tunnels are on the other side. So that gully is just a natural occurring phenomenon that I will assume that at some point with heavy rains, water would have then exited out onto Bay Street. Things have changed a lot. There's still some collection of water in that area during high rainfall, especially seen on the Chelsea Road side of that gully.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Kevin, I have a question in relation to the Pierhead burial.
Yes.
Considering where we are today with ethical issues in relation to human skeletal remains, and that development is planned for this site, what is foreseen for this site? Are they going to just build over it, or are they going to do like Newton and start going to bedrock?
Oh, that is a really good question. The most I can say there is, by statute, the museum gets to review some planning permission documents. We've advocated for a watching brief. But before that, we've advocated also that a ground penetrating and geophysical survey be done of the area prior to development, because it is a known burial space. You're not thinking it might be, you know that it is. And if that is done, then that's the way to go. Beyond that, it is then about agitation, because there is no legislation. There's nothing to hang our hat on. The only bit of legislation on which we can hang our hat is the Town Planning Act, which asks of NGOs like the museum or the National Trust to review planning applications and make recommendations. But a recommendation doesn't necessarily mean it will be followed. And if it is then followed, you then have to negotiate with the private landowner or the public landowner how that will happen, because there is no legislation to act as guidance. You know, what I find interesting, and I've written this so I can might as well say it. If there's the wanton killing of a turtle in Barbados, there's jail time and a hefty fine. It's about $50,000. If I go there tomorrow and I knock down Parliament, all I gotta pay is $500. No jail time. That says what we value. So until we agitate and we ask for a change in legislation, this is the landscape in which we exist. Yeah. Sorry, I kind of went away from Andrea's question, but there's a recommendation for something. You're hoping that it will follow, and therefore one can do proper salvage archaeology in that area, which will then lead on to a much larger physical anthropological research once you've recovered the skeletal remains from that burial site. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, everyone.
Evening.
I wanted to ask, when you are conducting this research, do you all have the funding for the equipment to do the digging and to do everything else, or do you have to then seek that?
Sometimes we have to seek that. In most cases, we have to seek that. So, for example, what ideally should happen is such research is paid for by the developer, as happens in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in Holland. And then over time, that might allow the particular institution to have the necessary equipment to do that work. So I'll throw the figure. I want to do a good geophysical survey of a site. There's a wonderful piece of equipment that's middle of the road that you need. It's 70,000 US. We don't have that. We'll have to bring someone in. But we need to move to the stage. If we had legislation, you can then begin to have what is called a cultural resource management ecosystem. I was almost going to say business, but ecosystem that allows for these things to happen, and they become almost a second act. The same way that you go and get a surveyor to survey a plot of land because you want to buy it, then the archaeological assessment is done in much the same way. And the same way that you pay for the surveyor, you pay for the archaeological assessment, which means that students who are at university, who have an interest in what might seem to be a really interesting discipline, but kind of strange, can actually make a living. But more importantly, you get to uncover and recover aspects of your history and your heritage that you would never be able to because it is all buried. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Okay, cool. Thank you. And thanks for the question.
Just going back to Fontebelle, what happened to the skeletons then that were uncovered?
Right, so the skeletons that are recovered at Fontebelle are now at the University of Auburn because we do not have the ability to do the DNA and other elemental research to understand what happened to them. And so there's an agreement between the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and the University of Auburn in terms of the research that can be done and their safekeeping. Whenever they've got a new researcher, we not only are notified, but our approval is sought whether or not the research that they want to do is warranted on the material that they're holding for us. There will become a point in time where we will ask back for that material and it be placed in storage at the museum. The material culture excavated is within the storage at the Barbados Museum. No, it's okay.
And if I wanted to sketch some of those material things that were found, how would I proceed finding, being able to look at them or see photographs?
Well, the sketch of the material culture?
Yes, like the
Well,
fish scale
you
thing that you found.
you simply write to us.
Just write and ask
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
That's
you.
what we're here for.
Oh, sorry. And is there a plaque for the remains in Fontebelle?
There's not.
Why not?
You're asking the wrong person. Again, remember, I led off by saying private property. Very important. Private property. Wait, oh, sorry. Can you put that question into the mic? Hold it. Oh, yes, please do.
Sorry. Just the fact that the remains were found there and these were people and part of the culture, shouldn't there be something there to honor these people that were buried there?
The answer, in short, is yes.
It seems a pity that obviously the remains had to be removed because it's private land, but surely there should be something there, some memorial to say people lay here.
I agree 100%. And in fact, there's the need for such interpretive signage throughout our island. Because not only just for burial spaces, but sites of habitation, sites of resistance, sites of worship. Yes, all of that should happen. I leave that there. But I mean, by you saying that, let me throw this out. I think that is a wonderful opportunity for corporate Barbados and others to come together, that we can have such signage so that we can move about creating different types of trails throughout our island to speak to the varying types of history and heritage that is to be found in this 14 by 21 square mile island. And by doing so, not recognizing how it might, in fact, engender new business and new ways of looking at spaces, or someone deciding, oh, I like that trail, I can actually create a business out of it. You know, because you don't always know the unintended consequences of when you put up interpretation markers. But when I travel and I go to spaces like South Carolina or Washington, D.C., where there are these interpretive markers, there are then people in those spaces who've created walking tours, biking tours, coach tours, because the markers are there. And it brings jobs to the community. It, in some cases, resuscitates communities as well, because you don't know the type of art it might then inspire. There's just a whole panoply of things that happens once you begin to put down your interpretive markers. And in the case, in our island, a lot of that has to be driven by public-private sector partnerships of some form.
Let me see.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm loving these questions, by the way. Yes, ma'am.
Good night, everyone. Good night, Mr.
Good night.
Farmer. As a history student and as some person who grew up on my father's feet, being taught of my own lineage that goes way back to St. Nicholas Abbey, what I am hearing tonight is both agitating and saddening my soul. I'm making a statement more than, and what I am seeing is an immediate desire by, I guess, most of us here for community history to become a thing, for community history to be lifted off of not just the pages, but the walls of the museums and so on. And I think that this is more of a fantastic tourism product than a hotel. Yes? We understand the history of Barbados. It's complex. It's not nice in some instances, but we are here because of that history. And as a result, the intersectionality of that history cannot be avoided, hidden, or covered up. We either embrace it and make it a part of ourselves, or whole town will continue to happen because people are ashamed of the past. There's nothing we can do about the past. But as a history student and now an archaeological student, I feel as if I myself am losing grip of history and what is there for me to teach if sites that ought to have been preserved, because there's a comprehension, not just by government, but by corporate Barbados, that seems lacking in the preservation, not just of sites, but of the actual history to become a part of the totality of a society. And I believe it is the foundation of a healing ground for this nation if we are to go forward. Yes, our histories are intertwined, whether we like it or not, and it is not, cannot be avoided. And it saddens me, honestly. I'm sitting here and I'm feeling more and more despondent as to why am I studying history if so much of it is being ripped away as I speak.
My only comment there is...
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
My only comment there is, don't be despondent, because look at where you are. You're in a space where there are like-minded people like yourself and online who have that interest, who have that vested interest in their history and culture. It is for the continued advocacy and the continued research that will hopefully lead to a better valuation of it that will allow for its preservation in its various forms. I'll leave that there.
Good
Denise.
evening,
Good evening.
everyone. Kevin, I just want to answer your question that that you asked a bit earlier in your lecture. Indeed, it is Karl who gave me the list.
Good.
And he did not give me only that list, but he gave me many of the lists that are on the Builders of Barbados wall. And without Karl, believe me, there are many, many names that would not be there. Karl was and is a very, very generous person. When he gave me those names, I said, Karl, are you sure? That's your research. I said, anyway, I'll make sure that we have a plaque. Madam, a plaque. Nobody makes a plaque in Barbados. I've been asking. I've given all the names of every person that contributed, and the only two names on the walls are the two. I should not say that because it's a bit nasty. But anyhow, the only two names that appear on the walls are the two guys who put the bricks on the walls. That's what it is. It's unfortunate. I would like everybody to be recognized, but somehow it doesn't seem to have any importance in Barbados.
Right. Thank you for that, Denise. And in case, for ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know, Denise Renard Greenwich, for me, is a conceptor of the wall, which has a very long gestation process. When we talk about gestation and that which is unique Barbadiana. So Denise, I thank you for your perseverance over many, many years, and to have that up. And I must say that wall is perhaps one of the three main reasons why Barbadians visit Freedom Square. It is amazing how it not only speaks identity and creates national pride, but in a very interesting ways, perhaps one of the reasons why the space is as heavily used as it is, and therefore as not as heavily vandalized as it could be. There has been some vandalism, it happens. That's the nature of public art. But the families that go to find and then etch, somebody should have a stationer across the road, they made a lot of money. But it's truly important, and again, would not have been possible without that research. And in this instance, we can pinpoint where it came from. And it's really Karl, and it goes back to his thesis, Barbados, a Civilized Island, where he began to record the various names of persons who came here. But for me, the hidden gem is the naming of all of the persons involved in the Bassa Rebellion in Easter of 1816. That is a hidden gem for me on that wall. So thank you. I think that was the last question.
I don't have a question. I just want to respond to this young lady over here who is despondent. And I have been at the museum 13 years, day before Valentine's this year. I have been at the museum 13 years. The day before Valentine's this year was my anniversary. And I have been the museum's education officer since April Fool's Day of 2018. I like to tell it people just like that so that they understand that these things continue to have meaning for me and layers and so on. But what I can say to you is that while sometimes our older generations are a little apathetic with regard to our history and our heritage, our young people are very, very interested. They gobble the knowledge up. The museum has some youth programming that we do every summer. We do some outreach programs during the school term as well. And the students are hungry for their history, heritage, and culture in ways that perhaps their parents and their grandparents were not. So the longest journey begins with a single step. There are more of us every year. My students are going on from strength to strength, and I see them out there doing things and making their mark and educating way more people than I could ever do on my own. So that is why you should keep teaching, and that is why you should stand strong with the rest of us as we continue to do everything we can to safeguard our history, our heritage, and our culture. That's it.
Thank you, everyone. Very insightful questions. I really enjoyed the discussion tonight. I just want to share a little experience before I go. Many moons ago, I started studying history and archaeology at the Mona campus. And I remember then people laughing at me and saying, what on earth are you going to work and do after you're finished studying history and archaeology? Never mind, I was the first one from my year who got a job, actually as an archaeologist when I finished. But then Jamaica has had the capacity to absorb many of the archaeology students. We're not seeing that. We're not seeing that with Kville, the students who have this passion and want to work to safeguard their heritage. There are not many opportunities for them. This is where the advocacy that happens starts to create tangible things for those who are working in the field. It's like a cycle where as things happen, more things happen that help the cause. Doing heritage safeguarding is thankless work. It's hard. You get despondent a lot. But I think we do it because it's not because of the money. It's because of the love for what we do, and we want to see our heritage preserved, or safeguarded moving forward. I'd just like to say, our charge here, please do not give up. Continue to advocate for the protection of Barbadian heritage. Continue to speak out on the issues as they come up, speak on them. Even that's something that's not out there yet, continue to work to just build that voice in this area, because that's how the change happens until we can get some legislation. So I want to thank you again for your time this evening. I want to thank the museum and also the Department of History, Philosophy, and now Psychology for being the host for this event this evening. Thank you to Mr. Farmer for his very wonderful presentation, which was also very informative. I'd like to welcome you all again to the next lecture in the series, which will be Watson and Natural Heritage. It will be on the 2nd of April. And the speaker will be Professor Emerita Julia Horrock. So we're really hoping that you will be able to come out again on the 2nd of April. Thank you again for your time, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.